hard control versus soft control. This is a term I'm going to use to help explain the book 1984 by George Orwell's and Brave New World by Huxley. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the difference between hard control and soft control in these books. Both these authors were phenomenal in their own right, but in a lot of ways, they're almost polar opposites in many ways in their two books. I would call 1984 by George Orwell's hard control. The philosophy in that book, it more or less talks about how the population can be manipulated and controlled through different means. Most of us have heard the term Big Brother. George Orwell's, in his book, talks about at his time, a future world where there was constant war. In fact, there were like three nations who were constantly warring with one another, and alliances would change, and yet these wars would never really end. But also the concept of these TVs that would watch your every move or observe your every move, and how people would spy on each other and how the government would control the population through these means of terror, secret police, and even these national anthems or these rage sessions where once a day you would rage at this TV screen where you would see all this propaganda and news and you would just rage and get angry at it. Then your own nation's symbols and flags would appear, and then you would do make the symbol with your arms, and then you would relax. And this is a way of engineering or training people to obey the state. Now, I call George Orwell's concept hard control because it relies on, as the word would suggest, hard control, i.e., law enforcement or military more or less manhandling people, or a very extensive spy network, and a constant fear and a constant need of wars to keep people under control. But they even would go to great lengths to remove history and rewrite history. So there were elements of softer control in 1984. I mean, these arguments are very good, and Orwell's thoughts are very complex and I think to the point. But in a lot of ways, Huxley took a very opposite approach. In a lot of ways, he turned 1984 on its head. Both arguments are very good. Both viewpoints are very good. However, I think Huxley's arguments or Huxley's thoughts are far more advanced. Example, if you look at the caste system, you have the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the deltas, the epsilons. There were more or less these different castes where people were grown in these facilities, and they were almost from the start trained to fill certain castes in their civilization. Also, the way they were raised. If you were an alpha, you were encouraged to get educated, you were encouraged to read. But among the lowest classes, their social conditioning was incredibly different. When they were being raised and when they were being educated to fulfill their roles in society, they would have these books that were electrified. So when they would go touch this book, they would get an electrical shock. So after 200, 400 repetitions, these people would learn books are dangerous and they should be avoided. And also over the radio, they would have their opinions more or less given to them. In one scene, like the betas were listening to, it's good to be a beta because we don't have the responsibility of being an alpha, and we're still better than the gammas, deltas, and epsilons. So they were conditioned to like what they like. It's only the alphas that were really given a free choice within limits. The other castes were more or less trained and conditioned to like what they like and to be told what they like, and also the heavy use of the drug, samba. Even their sports and pastime, they were designed for consumption. It was designed to stimulate the economy. So the society was really designed for neediness and also for control. If there was any problems in the system, samba would be used to fill in the gaps. So this society, I'm calling it soft control because there wasn't a need for a secret police. There wasn't a need for a strong military. People were so drugged up on samba and so conditioned to being told what to like, there really wasn't a need for this hard control or for a very extensive spy network because the people were so conditioned. You did not need 20-foot tall fences to keep the people in. If you have people addicted to a drug, that's all the control you really need. I make another example. Let's take that TV show Deep Space Nine from the Star Trek series. Do you remember the Jem'Hadar? That reptilian-like race that was fighting against the Federation. Now, do you remember how the Jem'Hadar would wear this white capsule that would slowly inject them with this drug? And this drug they were heavily addicted to. And if they did not have this drug for 3 days, they would die. And this drug would be administered by this other alien race that was very annoying. They're almost half blind. They had really good hearing. They would listen into other conversations. They were like a stereotypical politician. And these annoying aliens would manipulate the Jem'Hadar, who were like these elite commandos, with this drug. You know, if they did not do what they were told to do, they would simply cut their drug supply off and they would die a horrible, horrible death because of drug withdrawals. This is an example of soft control. They did not need force to control these Jem'Hadar. They just needed a drug and the threat of simply taking the drug away from them. But they were also genetically engineered because they too were grown in these facilities. But they're also genetically engineered to require this drug just to survive. So do you see how it's not necessary to have a police state to control people? It's not necessary to use terror and force to control somebody else. Drugs can do the same thing. Also look at history, real history, Earth's history. Look at the Chinese Opium Wars. Is that not an example how drugs can be used to control a population? So I think Huxley in Brave New World made some extremely good arguments. People can be controlled and manipulated through very subtle means. You don't need an army, you don't need an extensive spy network, and you don't need overwhelming power or control. Absolute control can be attained in very subtle means. And I cannot stop and think about our modern civilization. Like, think of our economic system or our financial system. If you use a credit card and use it and pay it back on time, you don't get charged with interest. But if you use your Interact bank card, and if you go past your transaction limits, you pay a fee. So you're almost being conditioned to use a credit card. See, if you just use your bank card, you're just going to spend the money you have and not go into debt. But because you're being trained to use a credit card very subtly, you still have the choice. There's the possibility you will spend more than you can afford and go into debt. But even our currency is constantly losing value. By my estimates, I'm not a professional, but by my estimates and what I've seen over the years, money seems to lose half its value every 10 years. I look at what I used to be able to buy 10 years ago, and I look to what it costs now. And from what I have seen, it seems to drop out half in value. There's no point in saving money long term. Note, I'm not a professional financial advisor. So take everything I just said with a grain of salt. This is just my opinion and what I've observed over the years. So because money loses value, and there's no point in saving money long term, one more or less have to use debt. So you're constantly chasing after debt. Is this not a form of control and manipulation? May it be softly, you still have choice in the matter, but you're being guided and directed in a very subtle and soft way. This is a form of soft control. Now throw in a little bit of hard control, i.e. threats of war, political instability, and even the news giving one-sided news reports or fearful news reports. So you can use fear to manipulate the population. Again, maybe this is soft control, maybe this is hard control. You decide. You're getting news reports on things that don't really affect you. Do you really need to hear about some civil war that's going on the other side of the world, or some flood or some drought that's been going on in some nation you never even heard about before? Is this really necessary? Or even something so insignificant as some celebrity getting a divorce, or some celebrity getting in an argument with some other movie star. Is this really necessary? So there's elements of very subtle fear manipulation on top of softer manipulation through debt. And I'm starting to wonder more and more, looking at the opioid crisis, drugs as a form of control. I mean, one only needs to look at history, the Chinese opium wars. Is this not an example of control and manipulation? So, out of the two, George Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World, both are fantastic books. Both make fantastic arguments. But Huxley more or less turns Orwell's book on its head. Both make good arguments, but I think Huxley's arguments are better and more profound. And just the danger, what he points out, the danger of soft control. That being said, Huxley makes another argument in his book, in chapter 16, the need for a caste system, the need for different levels of society. In chapter 16, they talk about one experiment that they tried to do, where they took a nation and they only grew or cloned alpha class people. There were no epsilons. There was no other classes. Everybody was an alpha. And this nation fell apart and quickly fell into civil war because none of the alphas would do work that they thought was beneath them. And no one wanted to do epsilon work. They all wanted to do alpha work. So this civilization fell apart because no one wanted to work beneath their station. Later, in chapter 16, they use the analogy of an iceberg. There's the tip of the iceberg that represents the alphas, and beneath that are the lower castes. You have the tip, the alphas, and beneath them you have some high-level betas. Then lower yet you have your gammas, then your deltas, then your epsilons. And in this story, they make the argument that this iceberg model of civilization is the most stable model for a civilization to have. What are your thoughts on this? Leave your comments in the comment section below, and I look forward to reading them. Do you think a civilization could work if it was composed of alphas? Or if we were to educate or train as many people as possible to become an alpha? Metaphorically speaking, of course. Do you think this would work? So to end this video, I think Huxley's arguments are better than George Orwell's. Both are fantastic. Both are well thought out. But I think these authors give very good warnings to people in the future what to look out for and how civilizations and groups of people can be manipulated very easily and in very different ways, whether it be a very upfront, hard method or a very subtle method. I think these warnings are very valid and these arguments are very good. And it's something we should all think about at least once in our lives. The extent that we are being manipulated by others.